Welcome to our podcast series. It is sponsored by the Toro Law Review. We are today, we have a wonderful guest, a wonderful person that we're speaking with, going to have a conversation with, Benjamin Pomerantz. And I just want to give you a quick bio so that you'll know who he is, and we'll get to him in a second. He is the Deputy Director for Program Development for the New York State Division of Veterans Services. And in this role, he serves as the Deputy General Counsel for the agency, as well as working as the agency's legislative liaison and overseeing several of the division's programming initiatives. His work focuses on advocacy and assistance for veterans, service members, and their families on a wide range of federal and state issues. He has recently published a law review article in the Toro Law Review, and it's excellent. I highly recommend that you read it. It's excellent, where he gives many recommendations for the incoming Veterans Secretary. So we're going to start just by meeting him and letting him, give us a little summary of what his law review article is about, and then we'll get into some specifics. So thank you so much, Benjamin, for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think after hearing that very generous bio, I ought to just stop and quit while I'm ahead. But I'll be audacious and keep going. Working with Turo is a pleasure on many levels. One of them being that Turo is truly a model in the veteran services space in New York State. And we'll talk a bit more as the podcast goes on about one professor in particular, who I believe now is retired from Turo Law Center, but was a mentor to me early on and provided me with a lot of important guidance as somebody who is not a veteran working in this field. And often that raises questions. What are you, a civilian, a person who never served a day in the military, doing in the veteran advocacy space? And what's interesting about that is because when you look at veterans law today, there are some fantastic veterans law attorneys in New York State and across the country who are not veterans themselves. And if I can get any point across today, it's that there is more room on that bus, that there is more room for people, both veterans and non-veterans alike, to serve as veterans law practitioners, because there are 714,000 veterans in New York State alone. And wherever you are practicing, whatever state you call home, there is a sizable veterans population in that state. And there are unique laws, there are unique regulations, there are unique procedures, all of which veterans need attorneys to step forward and learn and apply to advocate on their behalf. So it's an important field of work and a field that I'm grateful the Turo Law Center, both with their Veterans and Service Members Law Clinic and now with the Law Review, have been so active and so engaged with as promoting it and teaching the next generations about this field as a special legal discipline.
Thank you. That is very important you bring that up. We have a lot of students who are committed to helping others, and they may not realize that it is okay to not actually have experience with any kind of military group at all and still find purpose and a great career in helping veterans and working with veterans. So I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm so glad to highlight that, because you never know who might be listening and who might be interested in getting more involved in that as a career move. So thank you.
Absolutely. And with the Turo connection, Ken Rosenblum, who was that professor who I mentioned, who was a mentor to me early on in this field, when I first went to work for the State Division of Veterans Services in 2013, pretty early on, I linked up with Ken. He brought me down to the law school at Turo to present on a topic at a conference about veterans in the criminal justice system and services available for them. And we got talking afterward. I said, look, as a civilian in this field of law, tell me what you, as a veteran in this field of law, think I should know, and what pitfalls and what bear traps I shouldn't step into as being a non-veteran. And he gave me one particularly important piece of advice that resonates with me, and in some ways dovetails in with some of the themes in the article. And that was when he said to me, look, when someone is telling you their story as a veteran, their story is unique. Their story before service, their story during service, their story after service. And when they're telling you about something, don't try and show empathy with them by saying, oh, I know what that must have been like, or I know how that must have been for you, or I know how that must have felt, or anything like that, because the obvious response is, no, you didn't. You weren't there. I was there, and it was my personal lived experience. And that advice stays with me to this day. And that advice is one of the most important underlying themes in the veteran services realm, because too often assumptions get made about veterans being a homogeneous group, that if you served in the military, you must check the following boxes. There's a lot of trainings I give where I'll say at the outset of the training, okay, let's take 3 minutes. Write down every word that comes to your mind when you think of the word veteran. And the responses often involve somebody who served in combat, and somebody who looks an awful lot like the G.I. Joe action figurine, and somebody who has certain characteristics as far as who they vote for, as far as what their political persuasion is, as far as what they believe in, as far as what mental health conditions they have, and so on. And that's the kind of thing that Professor Rosenblum was guarding against and telling me to guard against, jumping to those types of conclusions, that veterans are not a homogeneous group, and that each veteran that you work with as an attorney or any other field of work, or just as a human being, has their own unique experience. And the most important thing we can do is take a step back and give them that space and listen to them and give them the chance to tell their story without jumping to some kind of conclusion that we formed because of pop culture or Facebook or media or whatever. Let them tell their story.
So true, and such wonderful advice. I just want to tell you, you chose probably the best mentor around. Ken Rosenblum always has been, continues to be a beloved member of the Toro family. And so no one, he knows as much. He is truly the expert in this field. And I'm so glad to hear the words, the advice he gave you. It rings true. It's probably something that we would need to be reminded of, though, before we would begin speaking and hearing their stories, and to take a step back and just let them tell it and listen, with our ears wide open. And so thank you for sharing that, because that's a huge, that's a huge part of the, it brings everything together as far as the Toro world. So thank you. I wanted to get into this article also. You really took a lot of time to think about some excellent recommendations for the incoming VA secretary. And so I'd love to hear if you want to just sum up a little bit as to why you think these recommendations are needed. And then maybe we can get into some of those recommendations and really, so the audience can hear what they are and why they would be so useful. So why don't you just give us a brief introduction as to what made you write this and put this all together?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. So where this comes from is a couple of places, one of which I don't envy the new VA secretary. I don't envy Secretary McDonough at all, because he is walking into one of the most challenging jobs in the entire federal cabinet. Often we don't think of it being that way, but let's look at what the VA secretary has to supervise. He has to supervise an enormous integrated medical system, okay? The largest integrated healthcare system in the entire country. He also has to supervise a huge and frankly extremely bureaucratic method of benefits delivery for veterans and for military family members. And in addition to that, he also has to supervise the entire system of the national cemeteries. All of those enormous buckets are under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of the VA, in this case, Secretary Dennis McDonough. And that's tough. And like I said, I do not envy anybody who walks into that role, because it is a highly bureaucratic system. And it's one where sometimes the belief is that changes of a sweeping nature can take place overnight. And in certain areas, they can. In certain areas, particularly in the benefits realm and in the access to healthcare realm, there are certain requirements that are codified in statute. And it's going to take literally an act of Congress to get those things to change. The VA secretary can't wave a magic wand and change those overnight. So I wanted to focus in this article on items that, from my perspective, the VA secretary can address without having to wait for the United States Congress to take action. Items that right now are under the control of the executive branch of government, under his jurisdiction as the VA secretary, and items that, even though there's no lawmaking involved, are nonetheless vital in many ways to veterans and to their family members. And so that was sort of my self-imposed constraints on this article. There's plenty of things I could have written about that would require Congress to act, but I didn't want to go there. I wanted this to be addressing what the VA, as an executive branch agency of the federal government, could address without having to wait for the lawmaking process to take place. And that became the focus of the recommendations that I made here.
Excellent decision, considering, the efficiency of, if you can just take some of this, we don't have to wait for any kind of action. Excellent. So the first one that you brought up was adopting a gender inclusive agency motto. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how that could be implemented?
I'd be happy to. So the current motto of the VA comes from the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was basically the forefather of the VA. The VA dates back, as we know it today, to the end of the Civil War. And President Lincoln's concerns of making certain that those who fought in the Civil War and their families had some government agency to look out for their best interests. And that's what led to this quote of to he who has borne the battle, and to the widow, and to the orphan. Language that in the context of the Civil War makes sense. It was not meant, I do not believe, from President Lincoln to be exhibiting gender bias in any way, because at that time the armed forces were male. And so you had the pronoun he referring to the men in the military, and to the widow, and to the orphan. If someone passed away, particularly those who died in service, that their survivors were cared for as well. But it's no longer the end of the Civil War. It's 2021. And that gender exclusive language no longer is acceptable. It's no longer acceptable in a society where women veterans are the single fastest growing demographic of the veterans population. It's no longer acceptable in a world where we recognize, finally, long overdue, the number of individuals who are gender non-binary or non-conforming in our military. And finally, with the abolition of discriminatory policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, opening the ranks more for these individuals to be able to serve their country and to do so honorably and successfully, which, by the way, they've been doing for a long, long time before now. But they had to, unfortunately, hide their identity because of those discriminatory policies. All of this goes to say that the words of Lincoln, as stated, as the exact quote says, at the end of the Civil War, no longer fits modern society and modern military. And I have spoken with and worked with so many veterans who have said, we don't go to the VA. We don't access those services that we have earned and that we are lawfully eligible to receive because we don't feel that is a place that accepts us. And it starts with that motto, which we see engraved often on VA buildings. And that should be an easy thing to change, right? There's no statute saying this must be the VA motto. The VA secretary can change that motto today if the VA secretary wants to do so and demonstrate that commitment to the VA truly being everyone's VA. And the VA has said this. VA at least has said this for a while. This is for everyone. The doors are open to all. And yet there's a motto which says otherwise to many people. And the last thing I'll say on this is that when it comes to the words of Lincoln, I'm a Lincoln fanatic. I mean, behind me on this bookshelf here are books about Lincoln that I have read until the pages become pretty dog-eared. But the bottom line is, I don't think Lincoln is going to be offended by the VA changing its motto. And part of what guides us historically to realizing that is in the same second inaugural, in which he talked about he who has borne the battle and the widow and the orphan. He also talks about with malice toward none, with charity toward all. A very inclusive statement. and the kind of statement that would be reflected by a more inclusive motto at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs.
Right. And that's very important for us to think about. And times change, and what may have been the norm when Lincoln was speaking certainly is not the norm today and should not be reflected in the VA. So it's great. That's a great suggestion. And I hope it gets adopted in a serious way. I really do. And in this discussion, I'm going a little out of order, but you brought up the don't ask, don't tell policy, which leads me to another recommendation you have about finally just ending any repercussions of the don't ask, don't tell policy. So why don't you just speak a little bit about that as well?
I'd be happy to. So last year, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was federal policy, which said in a nutshell that if you served in the military and you were outed as being a member of the LGBTQIA community, or if, heaven forbid, you self-disclosed that you were a member of that community, you could be removed from service by the military as if you were some kind of a threat or some kind of a menace to the military unit in which you were serving. And this, by the way, was not ancient history. This is in my lifetime. Okay, this was not from way, way back in the day. This was during things like the Gulf War, right? This is part of the shared experience of the generation in which I live. And again, I've spoken to so many veterans through the years who talk about just the trauma that Don't Ask, Don't Tell inflicted upon them from their service, realizing they had to serve closeted by a country that they were saying, I am going to sign this blank check to fight and, if necessary, die to defend your freedoms, but I can't serve as the true identity of who I am. So that was repealed a little over a decade ago. Like I said, last year we celebrated that 10-year anniversary mark of the repeal, but there is one horrible remnant of Don't Ask, Don't Tell that remains. Many individuals during that time period of Don't Ask, Don't Tell were removed from military service far earlier than they wished to be because they were found out by their chain of command to identify as LGBTQIA. And so out they were sent against their wishes. They wanted to keep on serving, but they were told by their chain of command, no, you're out. That becomes a problem when it comes to one of the most important benefits and services that the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs provides, healthcare. Because in order to qualify for the Veterans Health Administration healthcare package, you have to meet certain criteria. There's a myth out there that every veteran who goes to the military now is able automatically to receive medical care for all things for the rest of their life from the VA. That's not true. Federal law, Title 38 of the U.S. Code, imposes certain requirements. And the most common requirement that we're looking at here is 24 months of military service. 24 months of military service. Now, there are some exceptions. If, for example, you are discharged early because of a disability that was caused by or worsened by your military service, you can get the 24-month requirement waived. If you received a hardship discharge or an early out discharge from the military, you can get that 24-month requirement waived. But you know how you can't get that requirement waived? If you were kicked out of military service early because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and because of the military's actions toward your sexual orientation or your gender identity or gender expression. And by the way, this is also not just limited to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there are plenty of other discriminatory policies on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression as well. So those individuals who, for those reasons that hopefully we can understand now as a society to be discrimination, were kicked out of service before 24 months, there is no pathway for them to access VA medical care. None. Okay, because it's not related to a character of discharge issue. It's related to a length of time in service issue. And so my recommendation is that the VA amend their regulations when it comes to access to VA healthcare to carve out at long last an exception for those individuals who were unjustly discharged before hitting that 24-month mark on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. Like I said, last year we celebrated that 10-year anniversary of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And the impression that was given was the discrimination of that bygone era is gone. But it's not. This one piece remains. And it's a problem that I feel can be addressed through that type of an exception to get someone access to VA healthcare if they were discharged for those reasons shy of the 24-month requirements.
To me, it sounds so logical. I'm just wondering if you know, have there been any, I don't know if it's technically lawsuits or any kind of appeals or appellate process where veterans have been making the argument that, hey, Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been repealed. We know that was not good law and it's not here anymore. So why are you still penalizing me for something that was wrong? Has anyone brought that yet?
I don't know if they have in the past. If it has been brought up in the past, I haven't come across it, not in researching this article and not in my day-to-day practice. But there is at least one such case ongoing right now in which our division is involved, in which an organization called Sage Vets, which works with older veterans who identify as LGBTQIA, is deeply involved. And also the Veteran Advocacy Project in New York City is involved with a gentleman who meets the exact criteria I was describing, wanted to serve a lot longer in the military, but was outed and then kicked out because of his sexual orientation. And as a result is not able, even though he's carrying an honorable discharge, is not able to access VA healthcare because he did not serve 24 months and he does not hit any of the exceptions that are described in the regulations that govern this process.
Right. That sounds like a perfect example of elevating form over substance. And I hope that people are listening and that this does change for those veterans. That is so, it's so great that you're bringing it to light. And speaking of, the healthcare that you sort of alluded to that they're looking for, I bet a lot of people don't know anything about healthcare at the borders and how that had stopped. And so that's another one of your recommendations. Would you mind just explaining a little bit about that too?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And this is one that was not on my radar at all until something called COVID-19 happened. So I'm from a border town, practically, originally, Plattsburgh, New York, which is about a half an hour driving time from the Canadian border. And there are a number of towns across the border between New York State and the province of Quebec and the province of Ontario, where the town contains a VA medical facility. And before COVID-19, veterans would routinely cross the border, go into Messina, New York, go into Plattsburgh, New York, wherever, and receive their care from the VA, and then go back to their homes in Canada. Yes, there are veterans of the United States military who, for whatever reason in their lives, choose to live in a country other than the United States of America. But there is nothing out there in federal law which says, well, when you leave this country, you renounce your veteran status. That's just simply not there. So they are still veterans of the American military. They're just living in a different location in the world. COVID-19 hits, the borders close. Now these veterans who would come down from Canada, and I'm sure also in our southern states, would come up from Mexico to cross the borders and receive care at a VA medical facility. All of a sudden now they can't because the borders are closed to non-essential travel, and these individuals are being told, no, you can't cross. So now they're in their homes. Now they're facing a need for medical care, medical services, and they're not able to make the usual arrangements they've made for all the rest of their lives in going across the border to the VA and getting that care. So the VA has been a pioneer in something called telehealth or telemedicine, the ability to conduct certain types of medical appointments through Zoom or through other online platforms where the medical professional is on one end, the veteran patient is on the other end, and they conduct the medical consultation and sometimes even certain forms of medical therapy and medical treatments in that manner. The VA has been a pioneer in that area for quite a long time. So I thought, okay, well, this makes sense. The borders are closing down. You can still get the care for certain things through telehealth. And the VA said no. And I said, what do you mean, no? The reason they said no is because of a provision of Title 38 of the U.S. Code, saying that the VA, the Veterans Health Administration in particular, provides medical care on U.S. soil. Okay, I'm paraphrasing here, but they're saying it provides medical care on on United States soil, which makes sense when you look at the time period decades ago when that statute was passed. There was no such thing as telemedicine in those days. There was no such thing as the internet in those days. But now, today, in 2021, we see that same principle being applied of care only on U.S. soil, even to telemedicine, which would seem to be an easy thing to cross borders with because the medical professional is still in their office and the veteran is still wherever they happen to be, and they're syncing up by computer. There's no undue burden being placed here on the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs in providing that care, from what I can tell, and the veteran patient would at least have access when borders close down during a global catastrophe like COVID-19 to at least a certain level of care through telehealth that they need. So the VA thus far has been rigid in their interpretation of that law to mean not just in-person care, but telehealth care as well. And it's my position, as I said in the article, that the VA can interpret this more accurately if they interpret it with a broader brush. Because, like I said, this law that they're using as the basis for denying that cross-border telehealth is a law that was passed and enacted at a time when telehealth didn't exist and when the internet didn't exist and when computers as we know them today didn't exist. So it's kind of like we were talking about with the motto. Times have changed and the interpretation and the application of laws need to change with it.
Yeah, I think we can say that about so many laws that were created before the internet or any kind of, electronic cyber world that we live in today. And that's a perfect example of that. It seems relatively easy to administer if the broader brush were to be used in an interpretation. So that does sound like at least we could give care in some way to people who can't physically get to the United States. So again, great recommendation. I want to move on to your recommendation that involves studying more about cannabis and understanding the effects that medical cannabis can have with anyone, and why that could be useful for the veterans.
Certainly. So this is another hot button topic, a controversial topic, and not just in the veterans context, obviously, but it's a topic where we've seen evolution, particularly when it comes to medicinal use. And the challenge that the VA has faced is that the federal government, in the way they assign what they call the schedule of different types of drugs, still recognizes marijuana in the bad schedule, one of those things that we're just not supposed to be talking about, particularly in the medical context. But elsewhere, we certainly have seen, and I know firsthand in the private sector, success stories of veterans who are experiencing challenges, medical challenges in their lives, who are able to go in states where this is legal and go to a dispensary with a prescription from a private sector medical provider and use cannabis as a medicinal treatment, regulated, okay, to be clear, regulated by a medical professional, prescribed by a medical professional. We're not talking about Woodstock 2.0 here. We're talking about medicinal use. And I want to make that clear because a lot of times, as soon as that word comes up, people start to think, oh God, we're talking about mayhem and we're talking about chaos. And that's not what we're trying to look at here. We're looking at what is the medical benefit for veterans who are experiencing both physical and mental health challenges where scientific literature that is peer-reviewed and legitimate shows that there could be, maybe not for all veterans, but for certain veterans, a benefit to this being a course of therapeutic treatment. And the main thing I'm talking about here in the article is let's look at it. Let's study it. Let's truly examine its viability and then make informed decisions based on those studies. And that's something that the VA has not even really been able to get to that point yet. I think because of the continued taboo of this subject. And like I said at the outset, we're talking about the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States of America. It certainly seems that given all the other places that are doing research in this area on how can medicinal use be effective and be productive, that a healthcare system of this magnitude and this size and caring for so many people who have served this country should at least be given the latitude and take the latitude to go out and conduct the studies necessary to make informed decisions in this area.
Yeah, I think you said it beautifully, and I think you were very clear in your writing, and you just reiterated that now, that you're only advocating really for, let's study this, let's look into it. Maybe you won't find it's beneficial, maybe you will, but you're not advocating one way or the other about the use. You're advocating for the scientific community to take a nice look at it and come up with some kind of scientific answer as to whether it would help, even if it's only a few people, even if it's not used commonly, but if it could help some, why not? And why not try that? I think we all do know that veterans do suffer from many service-related physical issues, service-related mental issues. And so I guess I don't want to speak for you, but it sounds like you are just advocating for anything we can get to help people who are suffering in some way should be examined and then make a conclusion instead of a blanket no before we've really looked at the evidence of what's out there. So
that's exactly right. And when we look at the VA, there's a history of this. The VA, like I mentioned before, was a pioneer in telehealth. The VA was a leading player in prosthetics. The VA today is a leading player when looking at suicide prevention and trauma-informed care in all these different areas. And all we're talking about here is one more area to study from a scientific perspective, from a medical perspective, and then taking action based on what the evidence does or does not show.
Yeah, I mean, these recommendations, the ones we've spoken about, they're excellent. Actually, in fact, all of your recommendations are excellent. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough time to get through every one of them, which is good because it will have our readers, really encouraged to read through. I mean, our viewers to be encouraged to read through some more if they're interested. But this has been so enlightening, and your work in this area. Normally I end with a thought, well, easier said than done, but not here. I think many of these recommendations are as easy as said and done. They're not that complicated, and they shouldn't require so much money or so much manpower. It's really just, some of it's just changing the mindset. And often when the mindset's changed, others will follow along. And they really are things that really can be looked at. I do hope we should really send this article directly to the new secretary. So we'll see.
Well, thank you.
I'd love for him to read that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time today and just having the interest in this topic enough to have me on, and for the chance to have the article published with Truro. I want to share with your viewers and listeners my email address, so that way if they do read the article and they have thoughts or comments, good, bad, or otherwise, I would truly like to hear from them, because these are issues of contemporary importance to those who have served this country and their families and working in this space. I want to hear from people and hear their thoughts and see what we can do to make things better. So my email is Benjamin, BENJAMIN .Pomerance, POMERANCE @veterans.ny.gov. benjamin.pomerantz@veterans.ny.gov. And please, it's an open invitation. Very interested in hear comments that people have, feedback people have, because these ideas will only come to fruition if people become passionate about them and talk to the people who are in positions of authority to hopefully say what Michelle just said of these are not meant to be mountain moving, but when implemented, they can truly be life-changing and even life-saving for the people who have served this country and for their families. And that's what a lot of this work winds up being. I'll close with this. There is a presentation that sometimes I give that I call Mythbusters of Veterans Law. Now, I'm not as cool as the TV show. I have no pyrotechnics in the presentation or anything like that. Nothing gets blown up. But the point is that there is so much mythology out there about the veteran services space, even among veterans themselves. Almost every day, I speak to a veteran, someone who has served in the military and who received a discharge from the military with conditions other than dishonorable, okay, who says to me, well, I'm not really a veteran. I didn't go to combat. I'm not really a veteran. My service is only in the continental US. I'm not a veteran. I didn't serve long enough. I'm not a veteran, fill in the blank. And it pains me to hear that every single time, because that is somebody who is not fully utilizing the benefits, the services, the resources that they have earned by virtue of their military service, because they believe, for whatever reason, sometimes it's because other veterans have even told them this, that they are not a veteran themselves. And so my encouragement to any veterans listening to this, or to any people who have friends, family, acquaintances who have served in the military, find out the facts. Go to someone like an advocate with the New York State Division of Veterans Services, or a county veteran service agency, or a veterans law attorney, or someone who works in this space. Tell your story. They'll hopefully follow Professor Rosenblum's example of staying back and listening. And once they learn the facts of your unique story, then an intelligent and informed conversation can be had about what you are or are not eligible for. But jumping to the conclusion yourself of, oh, I didn't serve long enough, or I didn't serve in combat, or I didn't, or whatever, that's not going to be helpful, because it often leads, more often than not, leads to the individual who is eligible for both federal and state benefits not getting them just because they have self-selected out. So if you served in the military, if you know someone who served, find the facts, find people like State Division of Veterans Services personnel, like the folks at the Touro Veterans and Service Members Clinic, someone who can guide you into what the law actually says and what the facts actually are.
Excellent advice. Excellent way to end that discussion. And thank you. Just thank you so much for being here, for agreeing to have a conversation with us, and letting us hear some of your insight and what you're passionate about when you are here when you're working on behalf of so many veterans in the United States. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. My pleasure. And to all veterans who are listening to this, thank you for your service.